Now, by this point in the year, you've got some questions that have been developing over the course of the year. I understand that. Uh, Chief among those questions, of course, as is natural, is how old is Mr. Grandy? Does he just teach about history, or did he actually live through history? Well, I'm not going to answer that question. What I am going to do is give you some clues. And my way of doing that is to share with you some of the music that I listened to when I was in high school. So let's share my screen and take you through a few examples here. We'll begin with Led Zeppelin. Let's crank that up. How about next? Let's go to Pink Floyd. Oops. That was not where that was supposed to be. Pink Floyd's not working. Let's move that up to about here. Okay, how about Grateful Dead, who I did see 5 times live. Little Shakedown Street. Carlos Santana, going strong still. And then things change direction a bit. Here's a little Jean-Luc Ponty. It's a bit of a jazz meets classical meets rock. How about Devo? I was into them for a while in high school. Turns out they weren't as good as I remember them. Let's check out one of Milwaukee's greatest bands ever, the Violent Femmes. Okay, that guy's sporting a killer mullet. And then, of course, there is the one and only Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. How I keep them going under. Sometimes it makes me wonder how I keep them going under.
Her brother's doing fast on my mother's TV. Says she watches too much, it's just not healthy. On my children in the daytime, Dallas at night. Can't even see the game or the Sugar Ray fight. The bill collectors to ring my phone and scare my wife when I'm not home. Got a bump education, double-digit inflation. Can't take the train to the job, there's a strike at the station. Leon King Kong standing on my back, can't stop to turn around. Broke my sacroiliac, a mid-range migraine, cancer, membrane. Sometimes I think I'm going insane. I might hijack a plane. Push me, come on, close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. Sometimes it makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
All right, there you have it. We'll see what your guesses are as they come in. We're going to move it on to today's or this week's lesson. So this week, we're going to move into Asia. We'll start with India this week, Japan the next week, and we'll close it out with China. It's a little bit lighter this week, quite frankly. A couple dates to keep in mind, as always. Wednesday, 12:15, we've got our Zoom session. I will send you the link again pretty soon. Would love to see more people there this week. The day after, on Thursday, I started last week. I had an amazing turnout, if you consider 0 amazing, which, you know, it has some interesting qualities, 0. That's Thursday at 3:30. Come on now. That's just an extra session. We will literally spend time just doing the work. So feel free to join me. Got a bit of a intro there to kind of what the theme of the week is and sort of what the story is. A couple dates to think about there, starting way back in 1599, when the British East India Company began to conduct its business with force in India up through the Salt March. Probably should have added the actual date of Indian independence, which is 1947. Indian independence and partition. All right, you'll find out what partition is in a moment. Some of you know already, and we're going to do papers on that. You've got this video recording here with a few questions to answer. An article called British Imperialism in India, and then a short video, by that I mean 2 minutes, about the Sepoy Rebellion. All right, following that, you have a short bit on civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience. Gandhi has his version of that called Satyagraha, which I'm not pronouncing well at all. Some of your thoughts, and then that's where the discussion question is embedded as well. Following that is the primary source analysis. You'll be looking at some images and some short writings about women in the Indian independence movement, and have some similar questions to those you worked on for Mexico's revolution. You'll focus on Sarojini Naidu, a really interesting character who worked along Gandhi and is certainly much less known, but certainly interesting. And so these are a little writing, and then you've got some short, very short primary sources and an image or two. Okay, not absolutely required for getting credit for the week for this assignment, but there is a 45-minute documentary on modern India and some of the fissures and divisions that exist between the wealthy and the poor as India becomes a developing or much more developed and wealthier economy. All right, and as always, there's a space at the end. If there's anything you don't know or had trouble answering, write it there and explain why that was difficult for you. So with that, let's get into the notes, and I will maximize this there. Rock and roll. Okay, we'll be looking at the struggle for Indian independence, the struggle against imperialism that ends in 1947. Not only does it come largely through nonviolence, but India itself is ripped apart in a massively violent act once it gains its independence. It will be split into 2 countries, India and Pakistan. So let's go way back to British imperialism. I'm going to speak quickly as always, starting with the East India Company. India would become the jewel of Britain's crown, the most profitable of all its economies. We started the year looking at our case study of Indian nationalism and I think we spoke just a bit about that at the time. All right, by the 17th century, British East India Company was chartered. That was, it was granted permission by the British Crown to exploit the labor and resources of Indians and to make a profit for Britain and for the company. The company will establish forts all along the coast. Will start making deal with Indian princes. There isn't a nation per se called India back at the time. Rather, there are sort of provinces. Of course, India, Britain, having much more powerful weapons, had a massive advantage. It will try to use those advantages in China as well. Britain will go to war in China just to gain access to its trade. China will be able to resist more strongly. We'll have a couple of interesting resistance movements. Of course, there's something called the Opium War in the 1800s, when Britain imports opium from the Indian subcontinent and then exports it to China as a means to get China by force to trade with it. Here it's going to trade opium for tea. Tea, of course, is a very important commodity in the British Empire, which controls as much as a third of the world by the late 1800s. Okay. The British trade in India and going to war repeatedly with various groups is costly. Eventually, the company pretty much goes bust, and in the process creates a massive pool of resentment in India for Britain, and thus begins the movement for Indian independence, which will take some time and will not really complete until after World War II, as I said, in 1947. A major event towards Indian independence is the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, just 90 years prior to India gaining its independence. This is when soldiers, Indian soldiers working for British forces, pretty much kind of reach their max. It's the last straw. Britain introduces a new gun called the Enfield rifle. The rifle is loaded with cartridges. These cartridges require grease, and the way to load your cartridge was to grab the cartridge, bite off the end of it, jam it into your rifle. Now, what do they use for grease? They use cow and pig lard. For traditional Hindus, they don't eat cow, and thus being required to bite on something with cow lard would go against thousands of years of tradition. For Muslims, who made up a sizable portion of the Indian population, as you know, they don't eat pig or pork, and so they encounter the same problem. Excuse me. The sepoys, or soldiers in India, rebelled. By the way, you might be asking, why would Indians serve in the British Army? For one thing, as they've become colonized, Britain is going to control the labor market. So this is a way to automatically have a job. Number one, it's a way to not have any suspicion attracted to you because you're obviously serving loyally. And some people felt that, you know, Britain was there, and perhaps that was to stay, and they were going to just work as though that were the case. All right. This pretty much broke the East India Company going to war against the Sepoys. There are hundreds of thousands of soldiers that rise up against the Indian Army. And at that point, the British Crown fully takes over India as a colony. Another key point is the Amritsar massacre in 1919, an incredibly tragic and frankly disgusting event. Again, as resistance grows, here we're at the end of World War I. Recall that Indian soldiers, in fact, colonial subjects across the empire, served Britain in World War I. And so they came back and they felt like they paid their dues. They're trained military. They put their lives on the line. They traveled thousands of miles away from their families. They put everything at risk, and they still come back to not having independence. It's not unlike African-American soldiers who came back from Europe, both in World War I and again in World War II, feeling like they paid their dues. They served their country loyally. They put their lives on the line. They deserve, at minimum, some civil rights. In this case, this is an outright colony, and Indian soldiers begin to become more and more restless, and the Indian population does. And they begin to engage in more acts of resistance. At this point, Gandhi, who we'll talk about in just a few minutes, is much more active, is emerging as an important leader. He's a popular leader, and he essentially promotes the notion of resisting the British, but doing so non-violently. And so in this town, people came out for a religious ceremony in Amritsar. They were not permitted to organize in large groups, and so a man named General Dyer orders British troops to fire on unarmed people who were at a religious ceremony in an enclosed courtyard area, killing and injuring hundreds. It was a brutal, shameful attack. And so there wasn't much that happened to Dyer as a result, but we can say for sure that this definitely inflamed even more the population in India to agitate for its independence. I mentioned that India was Britain's most profitable colony. I got some words under there, though. Okay, as part of its vast global empire. It's also an incredibly diverse country. And again, you may recall this from earlier in the year. Diverse by caste, which is an old tradition that will become illegal after 1947 with its new self-ruling government. Diverse by language, hundreds of languages. Culturally incredibly diverse. And the way people practice their religion and faith is also diverse. Britain encouraged these divisions, particularly between Hindus and poor Muslims. For them, it was a natural way to divide the country, and it was part of British strategy across the empire to divide and conquer, to foster resentment among the population rather than between the population and its rule, and to distract people from the real issue at hand, which was British colonial rule. But early in the 20th century, as the Indian independence movement is growing, which includes both Hindus and Muslims, tension between those communities also grows. This is a sort of a perennial issue that happens as countries are about to gain their independence, as they may be engaged in civil war. Diverse populations begin to consider, well, what will things look like once this war is over? How much power will my group have? Will I have full representation? Will I be excluded? And so increasingly as India moves towards independence, Hindus and Muslims are jockeying for more power, and each, or the leaders of each, want to be sure that their communities are represented. And you begin to see more nationalist, ethnic nationalist groups emerge in that movement. So you begin to see more extreme Hindu groups, more extreme Muslim groups, and they will pretty much take over this independence movement and lead to partition after 1947. All right. Sometimes Zoom, there we go. Okay, Britain by this point had monopolized India's resources. Again, as in Latin America with the United States, the push was for export. That is why these countries have been made colonies. That is why the United States casts its long shadow across Latin America to import the natural resources and commodities from those countries and to profit from them. For India, of course, cotton and salt were major products that the empire wanted to import and then send out in the world to either manufacture or trade. And they had a monopoly. That is, they controlled everything from the extraction of the resource, the manufacture of it, the trade and distribution and sale of it. And so Indians were kept poor in working in those areas, in those industries, and the real profits were being sent across the ocean to Britain. Salt, of course, is essential. It's basic to who we are as a species in our survival, and it came from the ocean. But Indians were forbidden to gather it on their own, to dry it, to evaporate the water, and to sell it. Just as they were forbidden increasingly to manufacture their own clothing from their own cotton. Britain wanted to control all profit making from those commodities, and those will be, particularly salt, will be an essential commodity in the independence struggle. Okay. Gandhi is born in the late 19th century and dies after partition when he is assassinated by a Hindu nationalist. He himself is Hindu, but he was not a partisan for Hinduism. He really wanted all groups to share in the rule and joy of living collectively in the country. He will not see that wish come true. He's born to a wealthy family. He is not a great student. He goes off to England where he's sent to study, hopefully to improve himself as a student. And eventually he studies law. He goes to South Africa in the early 1900s, early 20th century, where he encounters a vicious and racist stratification system, where there are three main groups. There are the whites, there are the coloreds, meaning people of Asian descent, who are Asian, mostly Chinese and Indian, and then there are the blacks. This was the system set up by the South African regime, which is essentially Dutch and English. And as the rest of the world in the 20th century is coming to terms with racism and beginning to dismantle racist systems, it takes a while here in the United States for sure. It's really not going to really become start to fall apart but until the 1960s. South Africa is actually ramping up its apartheid or separation system. Gandhi will read Henry David Thoreau from here in Massachusetts, writing in the earlier 1800s, who writes about civil disobedience. Thoreau went to prison just for a couple days for refusing to pay his taxes, because at the time in 1848, the United States was engaged in a war with Mexico. And you may recall, the United States ultimately ends up with about a third or more of Mexico becoming now what is the United States, western United States, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California. Gandhi's moved by this notion of civil disobedience. And so we'll see a important idea travel around the globe. Gandhi will make his way back to India and take Thoreau's ideas with him. He joins the Indian National Congress, which was a group of Muslims and Hindus working together, but as I mentioned, with increasing tension between them. He'll begin to call for boycotts. He's not calling people to take up arms. He's not calling for people to physically resist violently. Instead, he tells people to begin making homespun clothing. That is to spin your own thread to make your own textiles from the cotton that they themselves grew. He begins to gain a important status. He's called Mahatma, meaning great soul. His movement is infused with spirituality as well. And as I mentioned, he's killed in 1948 after India's independence by a Hindu extremist. You'll learn a little bit about Sarojini Naidu, who works alongside Gandhi, but of course is much less known when you look at the documents about the role of women in the Indian independence movement. Okay, she's very active. She delivered fiery speeches across the country. She spoke about women's rights. She spoke about the rights of workers. And she founded the Women's India Association in 1917, focusing on education and abolishing child marriage or arranged marriage. And she urged women to give up the foreign cloth, right? She urged women to go ahead and make their own textiles. She also is the second woman president of the Indian National Congress eventually. Now, she's going to be instrumental, along with Gandhi, in the Salt March. This will be a key event in the Indian independence struggle, and you'll watch I think, 15, 20-minute video from a film about civil disobedience around the world. You'll watch the segment on India, and you'll see some amazing footage of this incredible event called the Salt March. Naidu is imprisoned several times. She certainly pays her dues. Just as Martin Luther King goes to jail intentionally in the late 50s and 60s, as he is practicing civil disobedience, he'll be inspired by Gandhi. So we see this idea move from Thoreau here in New England, make its way to India, travel back as a concept, as an idea for nonviolent struggle and for love and for peace, back to the civil rights movement here in the United States. Okay, Naidu is going to lead 2,500 people to attack the Dharasana salt works. Remember, I said salt becomes an important commodity in the fight for struggle while Gandhi was in prison. It was not a physical attack. Basically, and you'll see something about this in the film, she encourages workers to go to work when the salt works were closed because of the independence movement. Workers were locked out, and they decided they were going to go to work, even if it meant being beaten. And they were told not to physically resist. So one by one, workers would try to make their way into the salt works factory. The Indian and British forces defending in Britain would essentially beat them one by one. And we'll talk a little bit about civil disobedience in your work. But the idea here that Gandhi and Naidu and the movement comes up with is that by not physically fighting back, the person who is beating you, who's using violence against you, will have to face their own brutality. Will have to come to terms with the fact that they are the aggressor. They're not defending themselves because the person you're beating is not physically fighting back. And the notion is to transform the violent person. This is Gandhi's notion of satyagraha, right? That not only do you fight for your independence or for your rights, that's the civil disobedience part, but your aim is to not win, but to convert the violent person, to make them to be like you, to be a lover of peace and justice. And so by not fighting back and taking those blows, the movement led by Naidu and Gandhi and others had attempted for the British and the sepoys to see their own brutality and to put an end to it by themselves. Okay, she writes, as long as I have life, as long as blood flows through this arm of mine, I shall not leave the cause of freedom. I am only a woman, only a poet, but as a woman, I give to you the weapons of faith and courage and the shield of fortitude. And as a poet, I fling out the banner of song and sound, the bugle call to battle. How shall I kindle the flame which shall weaken you, men, from slavery? So as I said, towards the end of your work, you'll think a little bit about the work of women in political activism. Here's a quote by this is Naidu's sister-in-law. You'll encounter these quotes, I think, in the documents. On that memorable day, thousands of women strode down to the sea. Oh, sorry, this is about the Salt March, right, where Gandhi and Naidu and others begin to make a march across parts of India from the interior to the sea. And the idea was that as they embarked with only a few dozen people, others would join them. They would all, and it's ultimately thousands of people, will arrive at the coast and begin to harvest salt from the sea in opposition to British law, which said that they were not allowed to do that and to profit on their own. So women and men were instrumental in the Salt March. On that memorable day, thousands of women strode down to the sea. And by the way, it took a whole month of walking. So she's talking about the day when they actually arrived to the sea with journalists from around the world, which is exactly what they wanted. They wanted to gain attention and to put pressure on the British. On that memorable day, thousands of women strode down to the sea like proud warriors. But instead of weapons, they bore pitchers of clay, brass, and copper. And instead of uniforms, the simple cotton saris of village India, the dress. Women, young and old, rich and poor, came tumbling out in their hundreds and thousands, shaking off the traditional shackles that had held them so long. Valiantly, they went forward without a trace of fear or embarrassment. They stood at street corners with little packets of salt, crying out, "We have broken the salt law, and we are free. Who will buy the salt of freedom?" Their cries never went unheeded. Every passerby stopped, slipped a coin into their hands, and held out proudly a tiny pinch of salt. Bear in mind, like the Soldaderas in Mexico, I'm asking you to consider, are these women who are engaging in what is traditionally or conventionally women's domestic work, food production, and distribution of food, are they fighting politically for the independence movement? Are they also fighting for their own liberation as women, but using the tools of traditional women's work to call attention to their own oppression? So that's something you'll think and decide as you encounter the documents. Okay, you'll think again about patriarchy, the system of male dominance, the notion that men are for the public sphere, women are for the private sphere, and consider the fact that these women are way out in public. They're on the Salt March, they're selling salt in public, they're taking great risk. Okay, so are they challenging patriarchy, or again, are they really just fighting for the independence movement as a supporting role? Okay. Salt March, well, eventually 10,000, it's a 25-day march. Eventually there's the nonviolent protest at the salt works factory I talked about when the British responded violently. Talked about the fact that salt was essential to human life, so it had a lot of symbolic value, more so than, say, cotton, which of course we don't eat. Okay, and then finally you'll look at partition. Notice on the slide on the right, you see India after independence, where a new state called Pakistan is formed in the northwest. Pakistan then is determined to be a Muslim state, and India to be a Hindu state. Okay. Okay, and then the three, sorry, I just lost control of my slides there. The three main leaders, of course, are Jinnah, who becomes considered the father of modern Pakistan, Nehru, who works alongside Jinnah and Gandhi for independence and becomes the first president of India, and then, of course, Gandhi wearing homespun clothing. Jinnah was a fine dresser, even though he's considered the father of modern Pakistan, which is a Muslim state. He was not one to practice Islam too traditionally. All right, the country is partitioned, again, violently and bloody, and masses of Hindus are going to flee the area that becomes Pakistan for fear of their safety. Masses of Muslims are going to flee the area that is designated as Hindu India to leave for this new state of Pakistan, also to flee for their own safety. And along the way, these massive populations are passing each other, carrying only what they can to start a new life, and fights break out, and thousands of die in this horribly tragic chapter. There is arson, massacres, people are forcibly confirmed, there are mass abductions, savage sexual violence, 75,000 women were assaulted. It's a terrible episode in modern history, with 500,000 dying, and 15 million people will migrate either one way or the other. You'll see some pictures in the documents. Long term is that India and Pakistan have never come to peace. They've gone to war against each other at least a couple times. And today, of course, the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party, really is drawing on that fierce resentment that dates back to 1947. You'll see a couple quotes in the documents. I won't go over those now. And pictures of people getting on top of the trains and hopefully to arrive to their safety. Gruesome pictures of where massacres took place. And people, many of them just on foot. So that is the assignment for the week. I hope it goes well. I hope to see you Wednesday in our Zoom session. And for those that wish to get some extra support on Thursday, take care. Talk to me if you have any questions. And that is it. Be well.